Well, hi, everybody. It's the Week in the Tackle podcast, the podcast where we look at the previous week in the world of soccer and or football and tackle it. I'm Tom Rennie, the host of the program. My co-host is a man you know from all the TV shows you watch. He's also surprisingly and irritatingly youthful. It is Mr. Brian Dunny Dunseth. How are you, mate? You all right?
Rennie, I'm fantastic. Looking forward to the, the slog of talking about whatever we are going to talk about, because it just hasn't been a great weekend. Hasn't been a great couple days. And here we go again.
I don't think it's a great thing. I'm not a marketing expert or anything, but at the top of the program to say it's going to be a slog.
Yeah.
Let's do that bit again. That bit again, but do it as if you're going to enjoy the program.
Rennie, I am so excited to be here. I cannot wait to talk about the weekend results. And now we're back in Champions League, Europa League, and even Conference League, which I know everyone loves to hear me say. So it's definitely not a slog. It's really exciting.
Use take two. It was great. He nailed it.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
There is loads to talk about, and there's one thing I'm looking forward to today, and we might have an alarm on the program. I don't know. Manchester United are going to be a topic, not the top topic. There are other things that I think are really interesting and I want to have a chat about. But when we get to Manchester United, I just want to prepare people for, I'm going to say, so Dunny, your thoughts on Manchester United? And you'll say, yeah, well, what about you bald f***? Sorry, Tim, that's what will happen here. So we're going to have a whataboutery alarm. When it happens, I'm going to start I can't do the loud noise. It doesn't work on this. So I might do something like, what about? That's what I might do when you start doing whataboutery, okay?
Yeah.
I'm not going to remember that, but I can't do that. What I wanted to do was a kind of really loud alarm, but it doesn't come out on this microphone. I just remember when I listen to the program, it always doesn't work out well. So we're going to do that, okay? Cool?
Sure.
Right. Let's start with, do you know what? Let's start with this goalkeepers thing, because I think this is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. This is Mikel Arteta speaking after the Everton game at the weekend, which they won. They won by 1-0, and the surprising thing for many of us watching, I don't know if surprising is the right word, Dunny, is that David Raya got the start as opposed to Aaron Ramsdale, who's been their number one for a year or so. They signed David Raya, who was so begging and desperate to come to Arsenal. He's going to games, sitting in the stands, and he didn't go on strike at Brentford, but made it pretty clear, you've got to let me go now. I've done my time, and they've acquiesced to such a degree. He's on loan at Arsenal for the year, and they'll sign him next year because they couldn't sign him this year because of the finances and all that sort of stuff. So Brentford could have said no to this because they want the money up front, been difficult about it, and decided, you know what? A, we won't because, you're our guy, you're a legend here, and B, they're obviously pretty desperate. You're pretty desperate. We'll make it work for you. We get to Everton, and Raya is starting in goal. Now, look, he played well. He's a good goalkeeper. But that's not necessarily what I want to ask you about. I want to ask you about these really interesting quotes from Mikel Arteta post-game, where he acted all surprised and like kayfabe annoyed almost that reporters were asking him, so, you swapped the goalkeepers. That's a weird one. He replied, I won't do the accent. It's the same rationale that Vieira played here or Nketiah played instead of Gabriel Jesus. I haven't had a single question on why Gabriel Jesus hasn't started, and he's won more trophies than anyone, including me, in that dressing room. I cannot have two players like this in one position and not play them. David has been tremendous. He's got tremendous qualities, as has Aaron, as has Carl. Please let me know who Carl is. Not a fucking clue. Sorry, Tim. But we have to use them. He then goes on to say, which I thought was really interesting, there was a game last season, or a couple of games last season, where he says, I would have changed the goalkeeper. He says, quote, I didn't have the courage to do it, but I'm able to take a winger or a striker or a central defender or to drop a 5 and hold that result, but not drop the goalkeeper. Now, Dunny, this is fascinating to me. You've covered loads of games as an analyst. You've played for many years in lots of different countries. The number one goalkeeper. Have you ever worked at a club where there hasn't been a number one goalkeeper for a competition? Why is it a thing that you only have a number one goalkeeper? And what do you make to Arteta saying, I don't have one and I'll pick goalkeepers depending on the game, and also maybe change them mid-game depending on how the game's going?
Well, we do have kind of a litmus test, if you will, an example, and that's in NHL hockey. And NHL hockey, you will see goaltenders pulled and being replaced mid-game, but usually it's because they've given up a tremendous amount of goals. and it's high scoring affair. So from a US perspective, we're somewhat familiar with the idea of that, but the reality is when we're talking about soccer, we're talking about football, we're talking about domestic football, international football, you're used to having an identifiable, clear-cut number one goalkeeper. And usually that is signaled, unless there's some type of injury, that there is a signal by who starts the first game of the season. And the guy who starts the first game of the season is the number one and the undisputed number one. Because when you have, and there's this argument that I've seen go back and forth, and I've seen it with national teams, and I've seen it, I've seen it with Major League Soccer, that when you have the personalities of goalkeepers, and goalkeepers are unique personalities, right? Everyone kind of jokes, a bit off, a bit weird, a bit odd, whatever, because it is an individual position, that the idea of competition between two goalkeepers, you almost have to have a great big personality as your number one and a guy that's not going to cause a lot of problems as your number two, but is still a good player. Because if you have two big personalities as your number one, well, then you're going to have an issue. And it kind of goes back to that analogy and that conversation from managers of, we talked about Jurgen Klopp, we talked about Jordan Henderson. Is he a real if he's not starting? Sorry, Tim. Does he upset the locker room? Is he chirping behind the scenes? And especially with the goalkeepers being kind of this unique usually a trifecta of keepers that train with the goalkeeper coach. And I've had this happen where you have goalkeepers that are chirping and talking and effing off this guy and effing off that guy. And it just becomes an untenable situation. So I go back. Now, I think let's use Arteta's quotes looking back last year. He obviously didn't rate Matt Turner because if he did, the arc wouldn't have been David Raya coming in, Matt Turner going out, Aaron Ramsdale, Syria number one. But also now that he looks back and he says, I didn't have the guts to change him. Well, that's twofold. Number one, he might not have had the guts to change him because that's the established goalkeeper and you don't want to lose Ramsdale, who's done a tremendous job at Arsenal, or you don't believe in Turner. And both things can be true at the same exact time. But now, when you say that, when you've arced the narrative the way he has, I find it quite fascinating because I thought, first off, if you're going to go for Raya, why go for Raya if Ramsdale is your number one?
Yeah.
But then when you bring in Raya, and now you've promoted him to give him a game that is not Gummy Bear Cup, Carabao Cup, that is not an FA Cup, that is not, quote unquote, a Europa League or a Conference League, because they're playing in Champions League, all of a sudden, I think it changes the narrative significantly, especially heading into a Champions League match day when you've been out of Champions League for 7 seasons. So I think it's a very curious situation. And if you're Aaron Ramsdale now, in an odd way, the pressure is multiplied because now it's not about performance, but it's also about mentality. It's about being a leader. It's about how you're reacting. Are you putting yourself before the team and before the club and throwing your toys out the pram? Or are you knuckling down, putting your head down, working your tail off and proving to the manager that you deserve to start? Because, by the way, it's not just the manager that makes this decision. Ultimately, the manager makes his decision. I also wonder behind the scenes what the conversation is between the goalkeeper coach, between the coaching staff, and then ultimately with Arteta making the decision. Because we can talk about training, we can talk about games, we can talk about history, we can talk about form, we can talk about trust, which is probably the most important, but then you throw in that trifecta of a coaching decision, makes it even more curious as to why. And now he's got this unique balance where I think Arteta historically has done a good job managing the narrative, but now it's almost like because it's not, and his whole thing about like striker, midfielder, defensive midfielder, center back, it doesn't hold water because this is a completely different conversation. It's a 1-for-1. It's not a 1-for-3 or, a 1 in the attacking phase of play. Those are always interchangeable. This is a guy who's going to start, who's going to play, and is going to be virtually untouchable in the starting 11 each and every single week. So to change him, especially when you change goalkeepers underneath him, that I think puts a ton of pressure on not only Arteta's decision, but the player performance and ultimately the results that fall in line under that umbrella.
Starts against Everton at the weekend. Got the start against PSV Eindhoven in the Champions League on Wednesday as well, Raya. And I'll tell you what's interesting about this for me. I was doing a little bit of data mining, and by that I mean I Googled it.
Oh, I do research.
I did all the research for the show. I asked him to do it. Last season, going through some of the stats, the two goalkeepers both played every single game in the Premier League 22-23. In terms of passing accuracy, Ramsdale won in his own half, but not in the opposition half, 22.5% to 37, a huge jump in terms of quality of passes into the opposition half, though, of course, Brentford did that a little bit more, so you take that into account. Clean sheets broadly the same, 14-12 in Ramsdale's favour again, a lot more shots being faced by Brentford than Arsenal, 5-6-2 to 3-4-3, but you go through it, and in general, on every metric, bar passing accuracy in your own half, which again, Ray is very high, 86.5%, opposed to 92, on every metric, save percentage, clearances, shots faced, shots saved inside the box, shots saved outside the box, catches. We go on and on and on through various stats metrics. Raya wins the vast majority of them. And with all that being said, you know, this is an era where there's the eyeball test, as you would put it. I think that's the way you should look at things first. But secondarily, it's all data mining. It's all stats. There's 500 people with laptops at every single game. You go to an Arsenal game and sit in the back row, as I do, squeezing in. And the reason you squeeze in is there's 400 teenagers squeezing their spots over their laptops in games, doing all the data mining for the coaching staff, right? So they know all this. And my question to you, and the sub bit I want to get to, because I think it's really interesting and I want to mine it a little bit more, but why is it with all this data, with all these stats, it's evident here that Raya is a better goalkeeper than Ramsdale. The paperwork says so. The fact they've brought him in says so. The fact he has changed in the moment Raya has come up to speed with the rest of the team says so. Why is it, Dunny, that Arteta can't say to us, to Ramsdale, as things stand, I thought we needed an upgrade to our goalkeeper? In the same way he's comparing changing the striker is different to changing the goalkeeper. Yeah, but if you sign Kai Havertz to replace Thomas Partey or Granit Xhaka, you're telling me you had an upgrade. If Declan Rice plays and Partey's on the bench, you're telling me you had an upgrade. So if Raya comes in and Ramsdale is dropped, it's not an upgrade. The stats tell me it is. The fact they push so hard tells me it is. So if it's that evident, why can't he tell us that? Am I just jumping to conclusions here or what?
No, well, you might be, but I certainly don't think you're incorrect in jumping to those conclusions, because I think there's an argument to be said that even if you go back and you say Szczesny, is Bernd Leno an upgrade? Well, at the time, he was deemed so. If you say Ramsdale comes in, is that an upgrade from Bernd Leno? Absolutely, that's an upgrade. Now, the Emi Martinez thing becomes a little bit more odd and complicated, but in a timeline where things were in super flux transition mode, and maybe we're missing it. Maybe by virtue of trying to figure out this word garbage that comes out of managers' mouths week in, week out, as they're trying to either protect or procure whatever narrative is out there, that the reality is maybe and maybe we can use David De Gea and Onana, even though that's not the right analogy or example right now. But maybe the idea is that a manager like Arteta is looking at Raya and saying the player profile of what he's capable of doing isn't just shot stopping, isn't just getting amongst trees for crosses, isn't just verbalizing leadership from his back line. Maybe it is with the ball, positioning, productivity in possession, building out of the back, that this is a continued evolution of how Mikel Arteta wants to add to his group. Because usually when you think about a new manager coming in, one of the positions that he has to get right is goalkeeper, to where there's no questions about suspect goalkeeping. You have a trustworthy source. But then as you get everything else in front of you, in line and in shape and exactly what you want to do, I really feel like the goalkeeper position is oddly one of the most important, but usually one of the last pieces of the puzzle that's put in to really solidify what the identification of how a team wants to play, whatever the game model looks like. And we should probably acknowledge that Mikel Arteta is constantly in an evolutionary state of what he wants his game model to be, and how he's adding certain player profiles to be that much more dynamic with and without the ball. So maybe we're getting it wrong, but the reality is because Ramsdale, England international, been extremely solid in this ascent back to Champions League football and winning trophies, or at least being close enough to winning trophies, that it seems an odd one, especially behind the scenes, that when you had a World Cup starting goalkeeper for the United States, Matt Turner, being not deemed not good enough, he's pushed out the door. Raya comes in. Now Raya's stepped above. And now all of a sudden, you're almost just waiting for him to say, Raya possesses what I want in goal, as opposed to, well, this is a competition. And it almost feels like he's trying not to disrespect Ramsdale in a way that he completely loses him should Raya at some point either not be his number one or go down with significant injury.
I won't delve too much into this because I want to move on. But I will mention on Tuesday's Grumpy Pundits, we spoke about this a little bit because it was just after the quotes came out. And we posted it on social media, so many of our listeners would have seen it already. But I'll tell you my theory on this is that he doesn't mention the game he's talking about when he talks about there was a game last year where I'd love to have changed my goalkeeper but wasn't brave enough to do it. The game was Arsenal 3, Southampton 3. And it was April 2023, and it was just after the Liverpool draw where Ramsdale was terrific. He made that incredible save at the end of the game, which stopped Liverpool from winning it. It was after the West Ham game, 2-0 up, and they kind of started to coast, and it went to 2-2 against a pretty poor West Ham at that point. And then they went to play Southampton at home, that Friday night game, and it felt like this is the moment here. And that first 15 minutes, he gave the ball to Carlos Alcaraz, who scored, and then Theo Walcott made it 2. The second goal wasn't Ramsdale's fault, but the Alcaraz thing was so massive. It was so huge in the context of the season. Friday night football, the world was watching, the world was listening. And I think that was the moment that Mikel Arteta thought, I need a better goalkeeper than this. And I think maybe in that game, he might have changed Ramsdale immediately in the first minute or so. That's where he thought about it. And I think that this might not be that conscious for Arteta. I think it is, but, let's say it isn't. I think he looked at this guy and thought, you're an 8 out of 10 player. Now, an 8 out of 10 goalkeeper is good enough for 95% of clubs in world football. It's certainly good enough in history to win you the Premier League. But you take on Man City, you can't have an 8 out of 10 goalkeeper. You've got to have a 9 out of 10 goalkeeper, 9.5 goalkeeper. You've got to have basically Alisson to beat Man City. If you don't have Alisson, you've got to have Alisson adjacent. And if we really came down to it and said to Mikel Arteta, you've got a choice here. You've got Alisson Becker, or you've got Aaron Ramsdale, who would you pick in goal? I don't think he picks Ramsdale, and that is the issue here. He can't get Alisson, and he thinks Raya is an upgrade. Listen, one final question on this for you. What about the other bit here, which let's say he's not disingenuous, that's too strong, but like a little bit, you're playing us a little bit.
He's protective, yeah.
Let's go with that. The bit about them changing goalkeeper in the game I find really interesting. I'm always fascinated by the changing kind of evolution of the game. We're already at multi-subs. We're already at 5 subs and a 9-man bench. Before you and I end this podcast, we're going to be at the whole squad's on the bench and it's unlimited substitutions, right? Yeah. This is where we're going with the way football is. Certainly at the very top level, Champions League, Swiss model, more games for Real Madrid for cash, all that nonsense we're going to have to sit through. Are we heading towards 4 goalkeepers on the bench and you start one goalkeeper, they concede a goal and it was their fault, you get the second goalkeeper on, you're now trailing, so you need the better distribution goalkeeper, so he comes on. But now you've scored, and they're going to start tossing the ball in the box because you're playing Everton. So now you bring on the tall goalkeeper, and then you've not conceded and just penalties or whatever, and you bring on the penalty goalkeeper. Like, are we heading towards that? And would that necessarily be a bad thing?
Yeah, I can't wrap my head around it. I got to be honest with you. I just can't. And maybe that's just me being a prickly old turd at this point in my life. Because I just can't. I can't. I only said that because I saw you were taking a sip. I was hoping that you would spray it across the computer right there.
Thank you. Got it in. I got it down. Don't worry, guys. I got it down.
This is what I would say, that if it did happen, I think you would have to, two things would happen. You're either going to lose the goalkeeper immediately because egotistically a goalkeeper coming out signifies that he's let the team down. He's lost the confidence of the manager. Those two things. Or number 2, you have to be acutely aware and open to what is going to happen. And I just think it's such an individual position. It's such a confidence position that if you start switching and swapping goalkeepers out, the chances of you losing them psychologically is just massive, absolutely massive. So I can't see it happening, but I would assume at some point, at some level, some teams or some managers are going to have the stones to try to pull something off. But the Big Six, I would be shocked if the Big Six, anyone close to the Big Six, elects to try to do something like that.
Let's move on to this thing about the laws of the game. Now, we've done a big decisions show a couple of weeks ago, so I'm not going to go through a lot of decisions here. I'm sure we'll have a time to do that again when something massive happens. There was a couple of managers' quotes, Dunny, I thought were really interesting this week. One was Vincent Kompany, the Burnley manager, following the 1-1 draw against Nottingham Forest on Monday Night Football, where I think they got quite harshly done by in terms of decisions. There was a kind of dubious handball against Sander Berge that I'm not sure it hit his arm, and if it did, does that directly lead to the goal? It's meant to be now directly lead to the goal, as opposed to that nonsense from a couple of years ago where if it hit the hand anywhere in the build-up, the goal got disallowed. So there's some controversy there. Yeah. But there was a quote post-match from Vincent Kompany, which said, here's the quote: "I have a decent business and coaching brain, but when it comes to laws and legality, I switch off." Which I thought was quite interesting. And also, is he telling us that he robs his neighbours' houses? I thought it was quite interesting. Is he going to steal your car in the car park? I don't know. And that came a day or two after Paul Heckingbottom, who's the Sheffield United manager. Now, I can't do this whole thing because it was an incredible rant. I'm sure many people...
I thought it was spot on, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a great deal of it. And it's something you and I have spoken about quite a lot, but there's a couple of bits in it that I'll just read to people who've missed it. He says, "The officiating's appalling." Spot on impression. "It's not about the football decisions, just game management. My worry is that all the focus on yellow cards, time wasting and new guidelines. The focus all of a sudden comes on time wasting, so they're dictating how we play. If you take goal kicks front back, you set up one way. If Spurs go against that, that dictates decision you make. We're getting told just to play a long bite, ref. You can't do it. Wes got booked for handling outside box, and then you're threatening him with another yellow card. You just can't do it." It goes on, but, you know, I've got two questions here. The first one is about knowing the laws of the game. Now, you're a very studious character, so this may not have applied to you during your playing days, maybe when you were 20 or whatever, in those halcyon days of black and white football and jumpers for goalposts. But I got concerned by the Kompany quote, because I think knowing the laws of the game is so important. I think it's so important, but I would think that because, you know, as a play-by-play commentator, I think knowing the laws informs conversation. Do you take from Kompany's quote there, and some of what Heckingbottom said, not necessarily the bit I read, that they don't really know the laws of the game and then coach the players to act within the laws of the game as they change? Or is that just not possible?
Well, I think you have... To your point, you have three versions, right? Those that are acutely aware, those that are indifferent, and those that but still understand the updated laws of the game, and those that are going to do everything in their powers within the dark arts to still continue to manipulate the game and just don't care. They'll understand. Everybody knows the laws of the game, but the interpretation is where it gets really difficult. Because what we do is we're super fans, right? We're analysts, we're game analysts, we're calling games, and we're basically and effectively trying to communicate what we're seeing with the latest versions of the updated laws of the game to give the best version of what we're seeing to the audience to then consume, debate, and then figure out where they want to go from there. The players themselves, though, it's very easy. They understand the parameters in which they're operating, but they are living and dying by these games. And I know that sounds kind of crazy, but when I say they're living and dying, success versus failure is their version of living and dying. Getting a new contract or not getting a new contract is living and dying. Making Champions League or not making Champions League, living or dying. Manager staying, manager going, living. These are there are consequences. There's not consequences there's consequences for you and I, but not consequences the way there is on the field. There's not consequences the same way for a manager and players. A manager, there's much more consequential issues that they are dealing with a day-to-day basis than the players, because it's easier to switch out the manager than it is to switch out the players. So to your point about where Vincent Kompany's coming from. I believe at some point managers just start muting the noise, because at the end of the day, you can debate either way. This gray area, as much as we were talking about effectively what VAR is going to do with technology, is going to get the plays correct. That's not the case. They're going to get a lot of the plays correct, but there's still the human failure aspect of it, because it's the implementation of the technology from human beings that leads to consequential failure. This is what we've talked about. We've continued to say this, and now it's only getting worse, because as we're verbalizing it and we're acknowledging it, we're trying to do this thing where we say clear and obvious mistake. Has the ball, is the attacking player clearly in an offside position? Like but still that gray area of trying to describe these words on paper to then apply them to the actuality of the game and still be in the gray area. Well, if he would have called it, it would have been a penalty. Well, because he didn't call it, it's not a clear and obvious mistake, but I would have been good if he called it, but he didn't call it. So it's not, we're doing this whole thing. So I believe that managers are just like, F this. Sorry, Tim. Just like, I can argue it, I can get mad about it, but like, does it really matter? Because they're going to make their decisions. And I truly believe more and more people are going to be numb to it, even though there has huge ramifications for success versus failure. I think to this point of like us debating it endlessly every single week. And it's like, well, what about this? Well, what about this? Well, this was the same. That was the same. Well, not every call's the exact equal, but this was really damn close. And well, but you didn't call that one. But then you called this one, and this one had huge ramifications. Then you apologized, but you didn't apologize. But then you kind of apologized. But then you said publicly you got it wrong. But still, we didn't get the 3 points. So it's like just this tumbling weed that starts to happen. But for Heckenbottom's conversation, I thought it was super interesting, because my problem with this extra time that's being added at the end of both halves, there's no reason to show yellow cards if you're going to do this. It doesn't have to be cause and effect. The effect is already there. The cause is time wasting. You don't have to show yellow card to be Timmy Toughnuts and show that you're ultimately in control and you've drawn a line in the sand. Now, if you want to do that for persistent infringement, no problem with that. But the idea of time wasting, you're already adding on time on the backside. So I just have I have a theoretical problem with these yellow cards. But to your point about his conversation, I thought it was genius, because what he's doing is he's talking about the evolution of the game of playing out of the back, the evolution of the game of possession. And what he did was he pulled the curtain back and said, hold on a second. If a team's going to press with 2 forwards and they're going to line up basically parallel to my 6, I'm going to know with my goalkeeper, my 2 center backs, and my 2 outside backs, and my 2 defensive midfielders, or 2 pivot, whatever, 6s, 8s, 14s, whatever the hell we're calling them, that there's a certain structure that's built upon, predicated on where the opponent lines up. Now, if they do the 3-man, where it's point striker, left and right, depending on how you look at it, and how they set up, guy right at the middle of the 18-yard box or penalty area, guys on the basically the direct line of the box on either side, that then is going to change. Does the goalkeeper touch the ball to a center back? Does center back touch the ball to the goalkeeper? Then they flare open. What's the move? So like for me, my mind starts to spin, right? And I start thinking about, as a former center back, what would the positioning look like? Where would I want to go? What am I expecting? But to his point, he's saying this is an argument against referees that quote unquote haven't played at a high level, that they are implementing the laws of the game at an extremely high level. But I rub my fingers together and it's the feel. And the feel is an example like this, in understanding just for a good 3 to 4 to 5 seconds, even 6 seconds, that you're watching the way that the front attacking opponent is setting themselves up. So inevitably, instead of just kicking the crap out of the ball long to try to win the ball in the second phase of play, that you're like, no, we're trying to play the right way. We're trying not to play direct, kick the ball long, bypass the midfield, and then try to just dig something out. We're trying to play football. Like we're trying to be the Brightons or whatever, the Man Cities or whoever we want to call. So there should be some leniency and understanding. If you're already adding all that time on the end of it, why are you being so robust with, I've got to show a yellow because it's time wasting? Because it's not time wasting.
Yeah.
It's literally the tactics of the game are being played out in front of you. And then how do you break down the opponent? If it's 10 to 15 seconds, I can understand not being flippant towards time wasting or the idea of time wasting. But if we're in a 5 to 8 second mode, we shouldn't have a problem with it because you're going to add 10 to 12 minutes on the backside of each half anyways.
I mean, I am starting to come out the other side on some of these new rules, the added on time. Like some of it is getting massively out of hand. I can see why Heckingbottom on Saturday was absolutely furious. There was 12, they were winning in 90. There was more on top of it for celebration. You know, where was the yellow cards for over celebrating? They never came in the same way that Wes Fotheringham got booked for, or was getting threatened with a second yellow for what he, did. It was a bit of a mess, really. And, some of these new rules, I actually am quite enjoying and I'm seeing a physical effect watching games when a player gets injured, and I'm seeing players pop up now. I'm seeing them pop up and say, no, I'm fine, I'll play on, as opposed to always taking the time, always going down, always going off, always looking to cause that delay. Because when you go off, there is a 30-second timer on you coming back on. And so there's a real issue if you're the centre half pretending to be injured, and players cheat. We know this. But you're doing it to waste time doing a bit of game management. But then you go off and suddenly it's a corner to Man United and you've got 15 seconds, you still can't come on. Yeah. That is working. I think that's quite effective. The massive 12 minutes added on, I'm not sure how effective that is being at the moment. We'll come back to that. I do want to go back briefly to the laws thing, because as you know, I'm obsessed with this, as you know. And one of my big bugbears as someone who books commentators, works with commentators, I'm a play-by-play commentator, is working with people who don't know the laws as they are. I don't necessarily mind it so much in conversation shows. Some player from the 70s is on and talks about getting the ball first in a penalty incident. And, that's not what the law is. It doesn't matter if you get the ball first. Just ask Chris Richards, who can feel massively hard done by at Villa this weekend. Yeah. I thought it was a great challenge, but they could argue alternately that he went through the man to get it, but I thought it was a great tackle, but whatever. The conversation of him getting the ball first would have made me wrong maybe in that conversation.
Well. Yeah, he played well.
He was good. I think he's a good player.
Oh, wait. Yeah, clip that, Horsey. Just for future reference, just clip that page.
I'm not anti-American.
Chris Richards is a good player. Clip that.
I'm not anti-American.
There we go.
You just don't have a lot of good players, but I think he's a good one.
Okay.
I think he's a good one. Him and that Milan bloke, I forget his name now, Christian something.
Musa.
That's the one. But in terms of the laws, right, I keep thinking about the movie Wrath of Khan. I do this every time. Not only do I have Star Trek figures behind me, but it informs a lot of my thinking on everything. And there's a bit in the Wrath of Khan where the Reliant and the Enterprise are in this battle, and both have been damaged, but the other one doesn't quite know. The Reliant's got its shields up, and Kirk has not put the shields up on the Enterprise as he should. And there's this bit in the movie where Kirk says to Spock, do you have these codes? These codes mean I can drop your shields. They can drop the Reliant shields. And Savick says, I don't understand what's happening. And Kirk says, you've got to understand why things work the way they do on a starship, or words to that effect. And by knowing this code and knowing the rules and knowing the laws, they drop the Reliant shields and hit it with a few phasers. Boom, back in the game. Take that, Khan, right? And knowing the law feels so important to me. Knowing the change in the law, because then you know how to manipulate the law. And that we were just speaking a second ago about last season, you could have pretended to be injured because you can go off and go on. This season, the law has changed. That might screw you over. It's a man down scenario. So in terms of players, because commentators I can do to the cows come home, I'm fascinated that there's not a weekly meeting to say, here's where we didn't interpret the laws correctly here. Here's where we can manipulate the law a little bit better here. Here's what's changed. And so here's what we do. And I'm quite surprised at it from a player's perspective, a coaching perspective, in this era of ultra data. Every marginal game we can get, we get it. Why not look at these laws and be like, right, that's changed. So how do we work that to our advantage? And it feels like from Heckingbottom and from Kompany's quotes, that isn't happening. And I feel like if you could know it, then maybe we'd stop getting the arm flailing in the air. We'd stop getting, Sander Berge. The Sander Berge one is interesting. I know I'm going on a bit here, but it hits his arm. If he then turns away from goal and keeps possession, the referee is not given handball. It doesn't lead to a goal. They restart the cycle and Burnley have the ball. Instead, because he keeps going to goal, having known it's brushed his arm, apparently, if they score from this, it ain't going to count. So if he knew the law and it's drilled into him, it's touched his arm, You stop it, you keep it, as opposed to go to goal. Like, is it not worth having a bit of a Wrath of Khan meeting every week?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised, quite honestly, in the next year or two if, like, remember all of a sudden we're like, Liverpool's got a throwing coach. And we're like, what?
Yes.
What? Liverpool has a throwing coach?
And they scored 20 throw-ins.
He's the specialty throwing coach. I wouldn't be surprised if there's someone is dedicated and someone starts talking about it publicly. But what I would say that because of the financial ramifications that certain clubs are under, it's going to be much more difficult to identify somebody specifically that is going to be kind of a laws of the game type. But I do think because of the amount of tech, because of the amount of meetings, and because of, goalkeeper meetings, defender meetings, midfielder meetings, defensive phase of play meetings, midfielder meetings, forward meetings, offensive phase of play meetings, corners, set pieces, all those things, that at some point, you could take 5 minutes and be like, hey, by the way. But I also think it's also up to, here in the United States, it's up to Pro. It's also up to Howard Webb and everything that's happening right now at the FA. Because what I keep trying, and I've said this to Howard before, like, I was just in Dallas and I ran into one of the referees, and he was like, oh, we just did our referee camp, and it was in Dallas and I came here. So we were all together for like 4 days. So they're doing fitness and strengthening, and they're doing all their camp work on the games, and they go through what is, what isn't. And I was like, by the way, I feel like this should be sent out not only to the clubs, like how you're, the continued evolution of the laws of the game and how you're applying them, but it should be sent to us knuckleheads. Like, we should be getting a hold of this so we can listen to it and we can think about it and understand what went wrong, what's right, how does it get better, how should we verbalize it, until we get to the point where it could be like, all right, guys, we're going to the refs. Like, and then we just lay out, we pipe in the referees, and then we can hear them kind of talk through it and verbalize it. Because I believe that there's still a huge discrepancy between the laws of the game, how they're being applied, the physicality of the referees applying the game, and then having the players understand the updated version, the laws themselves, the decisions, and making it, even if it's once a month. Hey guys, here's 20 plays. We expect you to sit down, be patient for 20 minutes. Here's 20 plays. You guys go through them. We'll explain. We could do a Zoom call. Howard Webb doesn't have to be in person. He could be projected up on the screen, or whoever it is. And then we can kind of like have a Q&A going back and forth. But I listen, I think until you have more of an open dialogue in understanding on both sides where the players are coming from, but more importantly, where the referees are coming from, that we're just going to be in the same position where we are, which ultimately is shining a bigger spotlight back on the referees and their decisions, incorrect or correct, as opposed to being proactive and trying to nip this in the bud a little bit quicker.
Right, I want to move on because we're recording the program just before Bayern Munich, Manchester United. So I know that Dunny wants to get away from this recording so he can have a full-on breakdown.
Harry Kane, own goal, 1-0 United.
Definitely going to happen. Imagine that happen now. Because we are recording this before the program, so that would be incredible.
Harry Kane's warming up right now. Yeah,
I'm going to go with 3-0 Bayern, Harry Kane hat-trick. We'll see who was right. But I do want to just talk a little bit about Manchester United, not necessarily about the Brighton game, which was super funny, I think, for all involved, and not necessarily about Eric Ten Hag's no good culture comment, which I thought was really kind of damning in a way. I came in because there was no good culture. I want to talk briefly, Danny, and get your view on, now this is where what about happens, and he mentions like David Moyes or something. But Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's back. Solskjaer's back. Dunny's coming to save the day. What was the song about Solskjaer? Was it Come On Feel the Noise? Was that Solskjaer?
No, You Are My Solskjaer, my only Solskjaer.
But that was the playing days one. That's what he played. What was the management one?
Oh, I can't.
Come on, Ole Solskjaer.
Oh, yeah.
What was it? Oh,
yeah.
That was
it
so
is,
good.
yeah.
I love Slade, Come On Feel the Noise. One of my favorite songs ever. But anyway, it didn't get fully ruined because people don't want to talk about Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. Anyway, he's spoken this week to The Athletic, and there were some really interesting quotes in it. And it supports a lot of your points, really, that you've made over time when you've not been all defensive about it. But this was quite interesting, Danny. He says, quote, some players weren't as good as their own perception of themselves. I won't name names, but I was very disappointed when a couple turned down the chance to be captain. I was also disappointed when others said they wouldn't play or train because they wanted to force their way out. In Solskjaer's only full season, he finished second, and they lost the Europa League final on penalties. That was when David De Gea missed that spot kick. He was sacked 12 games into the following campaign, a 4-1 loss at Watford, which was the end of that run. Then there was the whole disaster afterwards of who was going to be in charge. And that led maybe to the no good culture comments that Erik ten Hag made. But what do you make to that? Because a lot of that squad, it's not like it's been dismantled. A bulk of it is still there. Of course, Pogba has gone and Ronaldo has gone. But in general...
Yeah, but like Bruno, Harry Maguire, Jadon Sancho, exactly. Marcus Rashford, those
What do you make to those quotes, Dunny?
Well, first off, I was... It's been 2 years. So I was really surprised for a guy that kept such a low profile that he would decide now. And I don't know when the right time is for something like this, but I do have a soft place in my heart for Solskjaer, because what I would say is, if had they won Europa League and David De Gea hadn't missed that penalty, we're looking back at his timeline differently, right? That's just me. I think we're looking at his timeline differently, but it doesn't matter. I think when I read those quotes, number one, I think you're looking at a guy that's united through and through. And there's a difficulty here in this conversation, because what the badge and the culture and the locker room and what it meant to play for Manchester United under Sir Alex Ferguson, he's seeing it in a new light. He's seeing it in a different light. And he's trying, I believe, I truly in my heart and heart of hearts believe that he was trying to recreate that culture and identity of success that was at Manchester United when he was a player. Now, wherever you fall in line, not good enough. The reality is he's not Manchester United's manager. But I think one of the difficulties for him when he's pointing out players and their personalities, when he's pointing out guys about captain's bands, when he's pointing out players about trying to move, that's the complete antithesis, the complete opposite of what it meant to play for Manchester United when he was a player. And I would assume that's got to be really hard to swallow, a bitter pill to swallow, to see, hey, I'm the man, I'm in charge, I have to be the voice, I have to be kind of that visionary rock of what the past was and linking it to the present, and it being nothing like that. But I mean, you still think about, from David Moyes to Jose Mourinho to Louis van Gaal to him to Ralph Rangnick to now Erik ten Hag, it's really been this rotating cast of characters. Who's good enough? Who's not good enough? Who's worthy of the identity of Manchester United, which is really a fallacy at this point, because when you look back historically, what they were are not what they are, and we've got this big discrepancy of time. But going forward now, I mean, the pressure's results. And again, we talk about the eyeball test. When you are capable of doing what Brighton and De Zerbi have done for the past year and a half, with the amount of squad turnover, with the minimal amount of money that they have spent on incoming players, to have an opportunity to be, quote unquote, a smaller club, to allow players to bet in, all of that narrative is great. But the reality is, if you had no idea, if you took away the color of the jerseys, if you took about the names off the back, the numbers off the back, if you just kind of blurred the faces, you would have said historically, the good old years, that Brighton was Manchester United and that Manchester United was Brighton. And it's the complete opposite. So when I talk about stats and I talk about chances and the whataboutery and all of those things that you tease me for, the reality is it comes down to results. And right now, the eyeball test is what's failing Manchester United. And then on top of that, I'm not this is the Glazers' fault, this is the stadium's fault, this is the squad's. Listen, at the end of the day, you talk about the manager, we can talk about all the BS that goes around the club. At the end of the day, me personally, as a fan, I'm worried about one thing. It's the 90 minutes between the white lines. And right now, it's nowhere close. No, there's nothing to indicate that this team was capable of picking up where they left off at the end of last season. And I think that's the biggest kind of punch to the jugular right now, is that how do you swallow these type of performances where they're nowhere near passing the eyeball test.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of notes on this from me, really, in terms of performances. And you picked this out at the time he left. Onana's a good goalkeeper, but David De Gea made save after save after save. Hashtag Dave Saves to keep United in games for a decade. You really start to notice it with I think it was the João Pedro third, where he gets a hand to it but doesn't make the save. Look, De Gea made a lot of mistakes during that decade, but I think he would have saved that one. It keeps it at 2-0, then it goes to 2-1. They're back in the game. It makes a big difference having someone who can make massive saves. So far, Onana has not been that guy for Manchester United. So there's an issue there. The fact he's a pick from the manager as well also puts further pressure on Erik ten Hag, who's really letting down the balls at the moment. Come on, Erik, we need you. And I was just the Glazers thing I think is fascinating. There was I want to get you and Gabby Bonlahor together. I've got to make this happen. Gabby worked with us for a while at Premier League Live. Of course, a colleague of mine at TalkSport. I mean, you're the king of housery, but he would take you right up to the line. I'm not sure we'd get through the show.
Yeah.
Sorry, Tim, by the way. But his reply to Gary Neville done some whole quote about the Glazers, and he replied saying, God, I really hope the Glazers are rested and ready to beat Bayern tonight, which I thought was just absolutely excellent.
Well, I mean,
the Glazers thing, I know the Glazers thing, they're not great owners. They're set of the club with debt. I don't disagree with any of that, but they're also not the worst owners ever. And that particular team that got put out, and however they've funded the purchase of players and the wages given, it's still better than what has been delivered for their tenure. They've hired Louis van Gaal and Jose Mourinho and Erik ten Hag and David Moyes, who all we know is the greatest manager in history. And, they've made errors, but they certainly aren't the reason they lost it. They're just not the reason they lost to Brighton on Saturday. And I find it to be a bit galling that, they are bad owners. There are legitimate issues with them, but just shut up about it after the result. That wasn't their fault.
Yeah, listen, they've spent a boatload of money, and the commercial pirate ship that is Manchester United is going to just plunder all the gold that is available. I get all that. I think the pressure, obviously the pressure is historically and what they've done, saddling the club and all of those things are real. And it's not a discretionary conversation. It's a real conversation to have. And even this whole idea of what we've watched, this potential ownership change starting, it's going on 9 months now. I mean, it's just, it's really ridiculous. If you want to sell the club, sell the club. If you're not going to sell the club, don't sell the club. But don't fucking flirt with everybody in the world about who can hit the $6 billion valuation and then pull stakes up at the very end. Sorry, Tim. I held on to that one for a while. But I also think the pressure that's being applied from the outside is when Ralf Rangnick and Ole Gunnar Solskjaer are talking about basically these starting 11 caliber type of players that they were saying, these are the guys I went in for. And basically, then even Jose Mourinho saying but you got to, or Louis van Gaal, I believe, was but you end up with your sixth choice. You can identify all the players that you want and all the players that you could have bought at a perfect time before, outside of Jude Bellingham, which they came short and he chose Dortmund, which obviously was the right decision for him during his development phase. But all of these players could have been for Manchester United as well. So I think that's where it becomes even more of a difficult pill to swallow for Manchester United fans as we're now just kicking off in Munich.
One final question before we run out of time today. And I just wanted to mention this because it happened on Tuesday night, and usually we record on Tuesday, so we would have missed this. The Lazio goalkeeper, Ivan Provedel, scoring a 95th minute equaliser against Atleti. The last touch of the game as well. And I just wanted to mention, because I thought it was incredible, this. It's rare. I didn't realize it was this rare that a goalkeeper scored a goal in the Champions League. Not since 2009 has there been a goalkeeper scoring in the Champions League. It was Vincent Kompany, not a clue, scored a home penalty for Hapoel Tel Aviv against Lyon. That was the last time a goalkeeper scored, except in the penalty shootout, in the Champions League. First of all, as you mentioned, great header, great goal, great moment. But also, did it take you back a bit how rare it is this happens? And also, why does it happen? Why does a goalkeeper go forward when you consider you have 10 players do you really need the 11th player to go forward to try and score a header when in their career, how many times has Providel ever headed the ball? Probably like 10 times from breakaways, and that was just clearing it into touch.
Yeah, so we have somebody in the CONCACAF region who plays for Tigres. He's Nahuel Guzman, who is an Argentine. He's the goalkeeper for Tigres. He's actually the one that pulled it was like the clown trick during the penalties up in Vancouver. He pulled the thing out of his mouth.
Yes.
Yeah, so he scored in CONCACAF Champions League a game-winning header. Phenomenal header, like in the 95th minute for Tigres, either to win the game or to tie the game to go through. And it was like it was a big moment back then in the kind of like our region. By the way, great header. I mean, like bop, smack that header down. It was like great. So here's to your point, and I saw your social media about this after you've been verbally abusing me on social media on X for the last couple weeks, which I also would like to point out to everybody. Tom Rennie's on the threads. I saw him. He was acting like, what's so good about threads? And now he's on the threads because it popped up in my timeline.
You know what, though? I mean, just briefly on that,
Yeah.
Twitter's getting bad.
It's
getting really bad. Like the quality of the contributions, the lack of the people responding, actually being verified. I mean, the conversation was always quite poor, but you start to realize how important the old guardrails were when that kid has taken away all of them for money.
Well, you have no idea what's real or what's not because of that blue check mark, you almost felt like you had 95% that you knew that there was going to be a story behind it, that it was a trustworthy situation. Yeah. And now you're just like, who the is this guy? Sorry, Tim. So yeah, I'm glad to see you on the threads. I love the threads. By the way, WWE, I was phenomenal the other night.
You're on the screen.
Oh, I'm on TV with the boys like 10 times during Monday Night Raw.
My friend who listens to this program is the biggest wrestling fan, and he listens to this show as well and watches it on YouTube and whatnot. And he was like, "That's Dunny. I saw Dunny. You were literally sitting behind Michael
commentary.
Cole,
I was behind
guy.
Wade.
Yes.
Yeah, and Wade. Yeah, I was behind Michael Cole and Wade, and like we just watched it again last night. We were laughing. Awesome. I was like, because I could see his monitor, and I was like, oh crap, where Kevin Egan, Kevin Patrick for WWE fans. He every time they come to town, they hook me up, which sucks because I went to SmackDown last fall and Kevin was working Monday Night Raw. Now they've switched him to SmackDown and Monday Night Raw came to town. So I go to the event and he's not there. So in February, he's coming to town. They'll probably switch him back to Raw, but hey, it was awesome.
Hey, Egan, we're friends. When it comes to London, you got my number. Come on, buddy. Come on. I could sit in the front row. I could sit in the front row, couldn't I?
By the way, those tickets are like $400 tickets.
Oh my word!
They're like,
really?
They're like legit tickets.
Okay, well, we're not that good friends, Kev. It's fine. Don't worry. Get me the ones in the top row. Get me the back row
Dom.
ones.
Yeah, we're booing Dom. Like we're having a blast. And then Otis. Do you know who Otis is? He looks like the coach who comes out that always goes shush to everybody. Right, yeah. So Otis is the dude with he's got a mullet with long hair. He looks like Action Bronson. But he's just got these huge arms, and he just comes and he's got a wrestling.
Jim Bronson.
Yeah, dude. Otis is so cool. So Micah and Luca are like, Otis. And Otis, he's got that person where he turns really fast. It's like kind of like the John Candy or, whoever. And he turns, and he looks at him and he walks over and he you guys decided? Let's go. You guys decided? We're going to get him. And he grabs Micah's hand and hits him in the shoulder. And Micah goes, holy shit, he hit me so hard. Sorry, Tim. So yeah, dude, I had to bring up WWE. It was incredible. It was awesome. So anyways, back to goalkeeper.
Yes.
Really quick. Here's the one thing to remember. Usually goalkeepers are bigger, taller, more of a presence. You have kind of the attacking players that'll drop outside the penalty area to kind of be more of a balance. Should the ball be cleared in a transition opportunity, last ditch effort, why not go for it? You're already losing. It's group stage. It's not knockout round. Maybe it looks a little bit different, feels a little bit different. But they're psychopaths, man. Goalkeepers, they fancy themselves as real goal scorers. You're either a number 10, like Miola. When Miola plays, he doesn't even tie his shoelaces. He's like, I'm a 10, I'm a goalkeeper, post up, play me, bro. Let's play through. That's what they think they are. So a game-winning opportunity, put it in the fucking box, Mike. Sorry, Tim. Let's go. And then he just crashes, he runs, he jumps and goes super hard. And that's their mentality. So yeah, great goal.
It might be, to round off the show where we began, the reason why we have 7 goalkeepers on the bench, because if it's Mikel Arteta, Arsenal manager in 2035, he'd be like, right, Get the tall goalkeeper on for the last minute. We'll score from the corner, get him off again, and then maybe Aaron Ramsdale gets a few little minutes at the end. Right, there you go. Good show, everybody. That's Brian Dunseth. I'm Tom Rennie. The podcast is called Week in the Tackle. Tim Horsey has the very difficult job of cutting the swearing out of the programme, and we'll be back next week.